Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Always like to begin these programs with thank the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, Megan Torrey, the Executive Director, President, CEO, and Abby Noyes, who helps her on all of the programs. Before we get started with tonight's program, I have to tell you about something that's very exciting that's going to be happening in Connecticut on March 31st at noon Eastern. Megan has corralled, she has Senator Chris Murphy for a town meeting again Monday, March 31st at noon. That's a free program. So just go to the World Affairs Council of Connecticut website, ctwac.org, to register for what clearly is going to be a very timely and important program. That makes me think too about all of you who support WorldNow with Jim Falk and the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. I was looking at the list and I see many of you have made donations for tonight's program. Very grateful for that. So thank you. So when Ted kindly accepted our invitation, I thought we would concentrate on the book, When the World Closed Its Doors. But as all of us know, a lot's been happening between the special relationship between the United States and Canada. So we are certainly going to take advantage of his deep expertise with this issue, trade and U.S.-Canadian relations. Ted Alden joined the Council on Foreign Relations in 2007. He's now a senior fellow where he specializes on trade and immigration with special attention to economic competitiveness. Earlier in his career, he worked at the Financial Times and, in fact, served as Canada's bureau chief, Financial Times bureau chief for Canada in Toronto, and then also the Washington bureau chief in Washington. He earned his degree in political science from the University of British Columbia, later a master's degree in international relations from the University of California at Berkeley. And this book, When the World Closed Its Doors, the COVID-19 Tragedy and the Future of Borders, he co-wrote with Laurie Trautman, and she is the director of the Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University, and also a global fellow at the Wilson Center. Parenthetically, I hope the Wilson Center is still around. In addition to the title of tonight's conversation, Ted is the author of a number of books: Failure to Adjust, How Americans Got Left Behind in the Global Economy; an earlier book, which was written in 2009, The Closing of the American Border, Terrorism, Immigration, and Security Since 9/11, was a finalist for a prestigious book prize, the Luca Book Prize for Narrative Nonfiction. Welcome, Ted. Great to have you with us tonight.
Good to be here, Jim. Thanks so much for the invitation.
And let me just remind everybody, my eyes are unfortunately too old to read the questions in the chat box. So I ask you to put them in the Q&A, and always like to weave your questions into the conversation. So please do your best to put those questions right in the Q&A and not in the chat. You know, Ted, you and I were talking in the virtual green room. Hard to believe. 5 years since we all really thought this might be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and lo and behold, it was what? Over 2.5, close to 3 years in some instances.
Yeah, I mean, both in terms of the pandemic running its course, it wasn't until well into 2021 when we were all vaccinated. And then the border closures in many cases lasted a lot longer than that. Bit ironic because when the US and Canada, Mexico all shut down, it was 30 days at a time. It was a 30-day border closure. That kept going on. 30 became 60, became 90, and so on.
Well, I don't know what Richard Haas sent out to you all, but I was looking several months ago at old emails. And my first email to the staff at the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth was, I think we'll be closed through the end of March and maybe a few weeks later than that.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, it was, they didn't call it a novel virus for nothing.
No.
This was not something that we were tremendously well prepared to deal with. And the book goes into one aspect of that ill preparation.
In your case, this was more than an academic exercise. Tell us about really the personal relationship, the toil that it took on you and your family.
Yeah, I hadn't really intended to write another book. My wife and I moved from Washington, D.C. Our kids were at that point both in university, actually in Canada. My wife's Canadian, Kids had both citizenships. The Canadian universities are wonderfully affordable. Son was in Montreal and daughter was in Vancouver. And our parents were aging, and we thought it's really time to get back closer to home, which my wife was born in Vancouver, British Columbia. I grew up there when my family moved there from upstate New York when I was a kid. So the whole plan was to be back closer to everybody, which worked for about a year, and then COVID hit and the border shut down. And I could spend way too much time talking about the various personal stories, but traumatic for my kids in different ways. My son, locked in an isolated apartment in Montreal, which had one of the toughest lockdowns in North America. Our daughter came down with mononucleosis in the middle of the pandemic. We thought it might be COVID, had to try to get her friends and our relatives up there to help them at a time when everybody was terrified. The bright spot was this extraordinary place along the border, which was unique not just in North America but in the world, called Peace Arch Park.
Right.
Peace Arch Park is almost 100 years old, and it was set to celebrate the world's longest undefended border, which is the US-Canada border, and the history of friendship between the two countries. The white marble Peace Arch there is a beautiful structure. Talks about children of a common mother and may these gates never be closed. And there's this really interesting park where you can enter from both the American and Canadian sides and actually physically cross the border to see other people without going through entry procedures. So technically you could be on Canadian soil as an American or on American soil as a Canadian and not have crossed the border. So it became this extraordinary meeting place in the pandemic for people who otherwise couldn't see each other. Saw my mother there almost every month throughout the pandemic. We'd even, go in the middle of winter and we'd bundle up and, there were shelters to sit under. And in the summer of 2020, it became an extraordinary place. Couples who were separated by the border closures heard about the park, and they started showing up from all across the country. You had people come from as far away as Florida in some cases. I talked to a lot of people who were sort of Michigan, Ontario couples, Detroit, Toronto, couldn't see each other. They would fly out to Vancouver and Seattle and drive to the border and meet in the park and set up tents in the park. The Washington State Park Service was okay with that. So I remember some summer weekends there where there were 100 tents set up in the park by all these couples who had been separated. So the opening chapter of our book is called The Summer of Love, and that was about Peace Arch. So that experience as I went through it, and Laurie at the time was working with both governments a lot, trying to create arrangements that might work for some of the difficult cases. Some of your some of your members may have heard of Point Roberts, but it's this little peninsula right out here on the West Coast where U.S. territory is actually cut off from the rest of the United States. When they drew the 49th parallel, the map makers didn't realize the little peninsula was there. And so there's this tiny little chunk of U.S. land. Well, throughout the pandemic, it was cut off from the rest of the United States because the residents of Point Roberts were not allowed to enter Canada. They, unless they had some urgent reason, they weren't allowed to cross the border. So Laurie had been working a lot trying to get special exemptions for them. And as we talked over the course of 2020 and 2020 and 2021, we thought, there's a book in this. And it's not just North America, it's not just this border, but it's global.
Well, I think I'm being almost facetious, but if I looked in the index, love is there almost as much as trade. And, you know, one of the things that struck me is that over the last, well, maybe say 10, 20 years, how people cross borders, love cross borders, work across borders, not just Canada and the United States, but Sweden and Finland, and there's numerous other examples, particularly in Western Europe. Give us some statistics or thoughts you have on how globalization changed the way people work across borders and perhaps now what is happening.
Yeah, so I think, what we saw happening for years and at some level thought would continue to happen was this explosion in global travel and movement of all sorts. So, there are statistics in the book, and I'm apologizing, I'm not going to remember them exactly off the top of my head, but sort of a 50, 60 fold increase in global travel from the 1960s and 70s to the 2000s. The foreign student business is an enormous business. Here in the United States, we have more than 1 million foreign students. This is true in Canada and in Britain and in Germany and many other places. People now work across borders all the time and work for companies who locate you in different places around the world. And then, if you look at Europe in particular, this effort to make it easier for people to move around the world. Europe, in many respects, eliminating its internal borders. Here in North America, there were a series of cooperative arrangements intended to make it easier to cross the U.S. Canada border, and even some efforts some years back now along the U.S. Mexico border. So I think there was the understanding was, well, if ideas are moving, if goods are moving, then people are going to move as well. These are all the components of globalization. And yet, I think when the history of the 21st century is written, we're going to see the first quarter of the 21st century as a time when those three elements got disconnected. Ideas continue to move, goods continue to move, though we can talk about what the current president is doing on that front. We're seeing some shades of the 1920s protectionist measures. But with respect to people, countries really began to close down. The 9/11 terrorist attacks were a triggering event in a lot of ways. Countries built much tougher, more rigid border systems. Identification requirements got far more severe than they'd been before. When I was a kid going back and forth between Canada and the United States, driver's license was fine. Sometimes you didn't even need that, right? You have a credit card.
And believe it or not, it was pretty much the same thing on the southern border.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, those communities, I've spent quite a bit of time in Laredo and Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, you move back and forth really easily. I mean, it was obviously easier for Americans than it was for Mexicans moving back and forth, but people in Laredo all the time, when I'd visit friends there, we'd go over and have drinks or dinner in Nuevo Laredo. That doesn't happen anymore. And so that turning inward started, I would say, after 9/11, and then accelerated tremendously under the conditions of COVID. And I think we're seeing that continue in the aftermath of COVID.
What's the status of the Peace Arch Park now?
Yeah, it's tragic because people from across the world. I had a visit, a few months ago from a gentleman in San Diego who heads their Friendship Park Association down there, and the Friendship Park between Tijuana and San Diego is very militarized and guarded, and it really doesn't operate anymore. And he came up expecting Peace Arch to be still this global model. Both governments are busy shutting it down. So the Canadian government, in the aftermath of COVID, because they were not, at the end of the day, not happy with what happened. I mean, a lot of the border measures between the US and Canada were at the insistence of the Canadian government, because Canada had lower levels of COVID infections. They were scared about their healthcare system being overwhelmed. I mean, Donald Trump was fine with it, but it was a Canadian initiative to close the border in the first place. And so in the aftermath of COVID, the Canadians put a fence. It's not a formidable fence. It's sort of a low wooden fence around their side of the park, saying no admittance from the US side. You can only come in from the Canadian side. On the American side, beginning about 6 months ago, they began posting border patrol agents. There evidence that there were higher numbers of people crossing illegally in that region. And so there are now border patrol agents posted on the American side of the park. So again, you can't come in from the Canadian side into the American side. We've heard pretty reliably that they're gonna build a fence there. The planning is in the works to build a fence along the northern end of the park, which abuts with Canada. So the only place you can meet there now is the common ground in the middle, which is actually not that amenable to families meeting, because there's really no place to sit. And then foul weather, all of the bathrooms and the pavilions and the seating areas are all on the national, in the Canadian side and in the American side. And those, you can't go freely to those two. So what happened during COVID will never happen again, unless somewhere way down the road, the two governments change direction.
Is it not fair, however, to say that now across the northern border, there are more illegals coming from a larger number of countries than in prior years?
Yeah, I mean, there's the numbers are still tiny compared to what we see on the southern border, but they are up. The number of people crossing, equal number crossing the other direction. To be fair, from the United States into Canada, there's a problem in both directions. Variety of countries. In the Canadian case, it's a lot of Indians. It's easier to get a visa to go to Canada as an Indian, generally speaking, than it is to the United States. It is a problem. The question, and this, this goes beyond just this book to my work going back 2 decades now. The question is, how do you address that problem? In the aftermath of 9/11, there were serious, substantial, important cooperative efforts on the northern border. This recognition we have a common problem, in that case, terrorism, and how to try to secure the border against infiltration by people who might be intending harm to either country. And there was a very deep cooperative agenda developed between the two countries. Now we seem to have lost our imagination and imagine that the only way to deal with problems like drugs or illegal migration is to fortify borders. And the core argument of the book that goes beyond just COVID and diseases is you cannot stop problems at borders, right? You look at the countries in the world that were most successful in dealing with COVID, and there was some combination of mobility restrictions. They weren't useless, they were useful in various ways, but strong domestic public health measures. And you look at a country like South Korea that produced some of the best outcomes in the world without ever actually closing its border. You had to quarantine if you wanted to go to South Korea, but you could go to South Korea. So with much less restriction on mobility. And really the same thing is true when you're dealing with illegal migration. And the US and Canadian governments need to work together on the problem. It may involve tightening the visa systems in different ways. It may involve joint patrols of different sorts. But the notion that by just fortifying borders ever more, building more fences, putting more agents, more barriers, that you're going to solve this problem, history suggests otherwise. And the personal costs of doing so are very high. And I actually think the costs in terms of relations between nations, in the case of countries, good fences do not make good neighbors. They make
Anecdotes, especially when you can make it about a person, an individual, have a lot of impact. And you have so many really compelling stories in the book, and we can't talk about all of them. That's a reason for people to buy the book and read it.
Thank you.
But tell us about the McAuliffe and how the government reacted, because I think that was one of the truly one of the saddest, and how it became a catalyst for uh, important change.
Yeah, so the McCalls were a
McCall's, I'm sorry.
Canadian
Yeah.
American company, excuse me, a Canadian American couple who met in Canada, ended up making most of their life in the United States. They had their kids in Chicago, and then later in their lives moved back to Canada to a small town in Medoc, Ontario. And so the kids, grown kids so they have grandkids at this point. Kids are on the U.S. side of the border, and why am I spacing out on her name? I just interviewed the daughter for a video we're doing, Megan, but I'm forgetting
Unfortunately, I
the
don't
mother's
have her
name.
name in my notes.
You got her name there?
No, I don't.
I'm forgetting. I'm forgetting. Oh, Donna, excuse me. Yeah, sorry. Sorry, senior moment there. John and Donna.
Yeah.
So early on in the pandemic, Donna discovers that she's suffering from liver failure. And, initially it's not clear how severe it is. And again, as you sort of said at the outset, I think the children, and as I say, I talked to Megan, who's one of the daughters, at length about 3 weeks ago. And she said, we all assumed this was going to be 30 days, or, maybe after the original 30 days, it would go another 30 days, but that we had some time here. And as 2020 moves into the summer, Donna's condition worsens, and John is really struggling just taking care of her. And so the kids are, we need to get into Canada to see our mother and to help our father. Canadian mother, American father, they are Canadian citizens by birth. Canada has birthright citizenship, the same we do in the United States, but they never applied or got their Canadian passports. So they reached out to the Canadian government, said, our mother is probably terminally ill, our father needs help. We will quarantine, right? That was the requirement. If you go back into Canada, we'll quarantine for 14 days. Can we come back? And the Canadian government says, no, you're not Canadian citizens. You're not essential workers. You don't meet any of the categories that allow you to return. The best we can do for you is you can apply for your Canadian citizenship, and we'll try to expedite the paperwork. And Donna gets sicker, goes into the hospital. The paperwork has not come through, and she ends up, her children end up saying goodbye to her over FaceTime. So virtually, a couple of weeks after her death, the citizenship papers finally come through, and the children quarantine, and they go up for a memorial service and to help their father. The case was, tragic at a personal level. I learned from Megan in this recent conversation, didn't know this when we wrote the book, that her mother, for various reasons, had also lost her own mother without being able to say goodbye. In that case, just thinking that her condition was not as serious as it turned out to be. So for Megan, this was particularly tragic. The case ignited some important action in Canada that ended up easing some of the rules for family across borders for these kinds of situations. But to us, it was one of many examples of bureaucratic heartlessness that
I
we
think
saw
there was that
throughout
other
the country.
case about the Al Jazeera reporter.
That one is a crazy one. So just to give a little background on this, the U.S. Canadian border closures, I would put somewhere in the middle globally. The
Yeah.
Europeans, the French and Germans and others broke the Schengen rules and closed their borders for periods of time, but quite quickly came up with ways to open again internally. There were testing requirements and other things, but the Europeans tried to move back to freer travel as quickly as they could. In North America, we were, U.S. Canada somewhere in the middle. The Mexican border actually was never all that tightly closed, particularly if you wanted to go to Mexico. I remember Ted Cruz flew to Cancun in the middle of the pandemic to
He's
mine.
still paying for that, I'm
He's still
afraid.
paying for that one. The
And
most
well should.
extreme border measures were China on the one hand, and we can talk about China if you want,
Yeah.
but then the island nations of the Asia Pacific, Taiwan, Japan, New Zealand, and Australia, particularly. And there was some logic for that, right? If you have the sort of control over your territory that island nations do, there was the potential for pursuing a zero COVID policy or something close to it. And no country was really more successful in terms of its border controls than New Zealand. New Zealand was a good place to be during the pandemic. I mean, they had some cases early on. Jacinda Ardern, who was the prime minister, instituted a pretty harsh lockdown that lasted about 45 days, but they got rid of COVID. And then they instituted this very extreme border system that was in effect a kind of lottery system. You had to come back, you had to quarantine in a select number of government controlled hotels. The only people who could come back were citizens or permanent residents, or in some cases celebrities, which created its own controversy. But there was a very limited pool. But even those people, there were not enough spaces for them. And so the story we tell there is a woman named Charlotte Bellis, who's a New Zealand journalist, was working in Afghanistan, moved back to Doha, which is the headquarters of Al Jazeera, and discovered she was pregnant by her New Zealand boyfriend, who's a New York Times photographer. She goes to the doctor in Qatar, and the doctor says, "You got to get out of here, right? You are an unmarried pregnant woman in a fundamentalist Muslim country. It is a crime to be pregnant and unmarried here. You have to leave." So she applies to the New Zealand government, says, I need to come back home. I'm pregnant. I need to come home and have my baby. And they say, well, you got to go through the lottery like everybody else. She keeps applying, not getting in. She and her boyfriend end up going to Belgium for a little while, which is where he's originally from. She continues to apply, and she's getting on, right? 4 months, 5 months pregnant. She's starting to get more desperate. She can't stay in Europe. She doesn't have permission. She can't go back to Qatar. So in desperation, she applies to the Taliban government. She and her boyfriend had been living there, saying, "Can I come back to Afghanistan to have my baby?" And the Taliban government says, "Yeah, you're an infidel, and so whatever, you can come back to Afghanistan." But Afghanistan had at the time, probably still does, pretty much the highest maternal mortality rate in the world for women having babies. So she really didn't want to have her baby in Afghanistan. Gets back there and applies one last time to the New Zealand government for an emergency override, saying, "Look, I desperately need to come home." The New Zealand government says, "No, being pregnant is not a condition that warrants an emergency override." Again, this is a citizen, right? Asking to return to her own country. At that point, she goes public with her story, writes an article in the New Zealand Herald, and the outrage is such that the government relents. But
That's what I think is interesting, that in many cases, specifically that one, public outcry, as you said, made a difference. People on the streets made forced some changes.
yeah, well, sort of. I mean, in her case, it was a weird kind of one-off. The New Zealand government, we don't go into all the details in the book, but the New Zealand government actually didn't acknowledge that she had a legitimate reason in terms of her pregnancy to come home. They made the claim that Afghanistan was an unsafe place, and that was why she needed to come home. So they never acknowledged, and there were about 30 New Zealand women who were pregnant who had to fight similar battles to get back home. And Charlotte, again, we were doing a follow up video, and I learned some things I didn't know when we wrote the book, which is that she said she was the subject of vicious online attacks from a lot of New Zealanders. So
Hmm.
the government was embarrassed by this, but there were a lot of New Zealanders who were like, "We don't really want you coming home, right? You might bring COVID back here." So there was this kind of intense tribalism that in its most extreme forms, and New Zealand is one of the most extreme forms, not only said we need to keep foreigners out because they might make us sick, we even need to keep our own citizens out. We need to turn
And New
any.
Zealand was not unique in that, right? I mean,
It
there
was
were other,
almost unique. Australia was the other country that did
right.
it. And at one point in the pandemic, in fact, when you had the Delta variant, people may remember that that was the most lethal of the different variants. It got overtaken by the Omicron variant, which was fortunately less lethal. But for a period of time, the Delta variant was growing, particularly in India. And the Australian government issued a legal ban on any Australians coming back home if they had been in India in the previous 14 days, which was extraordinary, right? In the New Zealand case, and mostly in Australia, it was sort of a de facto ban. It was, we have this public health system that we've set up, and there are only so many spots. And if you don't get one, you're out of luck. And that was mostly the way Australia operated as well. But for a period of a couple of months in 2021, it was actually illegal for Australians who'd been in India to return home. And it raises big questions about what does citizenship mean?
Well, what about travel
Legally hard.
within countries?
Say that
China,
again, sorry.
what about travel within countries?
In various places, Australia had quite strong internal travel restrictions among its various states. Canada, there were restrictions in the maritime provinces. They called it the Atlantic bubble. Here, briefly, Florida tried to force people coming down from New York to quarantine for 2 weeks. It was never enforced, but when New York had the worst outbreak, tribal areas here were closed to outsiders. There's a sort of history there. The native tribes in the United States and in Canada suffered disproportionately from the Spanish flu. The Alaska natives were wiped out by the Spanish flu. So there were restrictions on tribal lands. So yeah, there were some internal travel restrictions as well during the pandemic.
Well, we're half past the hour. We have a few questions. Keep on sending them because we'll get to them. Enjoyable conversation with Ted Alden. He's the author of When the World Closed Its Doors. Uh, Ted, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some of the preventive measures that the WHO, the World Health Organization, CDC had in place going back probably decades, but particularly going back to SARS and Ebola. And as the United States, I'm not sure what the status is today, but probably is withdrawing from the WHO.
Yeah.
Clearly, it was criticized because of being perhaps pushed by China, but just sort of take that and run with it, if you would, for a few minutes.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the WHO, in the wake of SARS, came up with a set of procedures that member countries were expected to follow in the case of an outbreak of a virus that had pandemic potential. And there were sort of two pillars to it. The one was countries were supposed to report everything they knew as early as they possibly knew it, to go to the WHO, to go to the international scientific and public health community and say, we've got something here that looks potentially dangerous. Come help. And the second part of it was that in exchange for that kind of transparency, other countries would not close their borders to citizens of that country. And the worry was, and this had happened in the past, it happened some during SARS, it happened to a lesser extent during Ebola, it happened in other outbreaks where countries were acknowledged that they had a problem, and the response was travel bans, which were often economically very costly. I mean, in the midst of COVID, South Africa discovered and reported to the world the existence of the Omicron variant, which came out of that region. They said, look, we've got this new variant. We think it's going to become the dominant variant. We're doing our, we're fulfilling our WHO obligation reporting this. And the Europeans and the United States and many other countries instituted a fresh travel ban. This was late in 2021 against South Africa and its neighboring countries. So WHO said, no, that's not a good idea. That, except for sometimes very temporary and targeted border closures, we should keep borders open. And what we saw during COVID was a failure of both sides of that equation. The Chinese were not forthcoming, as they had not been during SARS. And so they delayed for a long time in reporting to the world what was going on in Wuhan and the evidence that there was a dangerous new virus here. And as a result, by the time the world really learned what was going on, the virus had spread quite widely around the world. And so a lot of countries, I think, feeling like they had no other good options, they didn't really know how to handle the cases internally, were like, well, let's shut our borders to China and hopefully keep the case numbers down. China protested, as China often does, said, oh, this violates the WHO, which was true. But of course, the Chinese themselves had violated their obligations by not reporting in a transparent way. So I'm afraid the net result of that was a rather catastrophic breakdown in the system that the WHO had rather painstakingly created through a series of negotiations about how countries would cooperate during pandemics and potential pandemics, and why that cooperative approach was a better approach. And I'm afraid we're moving utterly away from that. I mean, the Trump administration, apart from its love of closing borders, is gutting, both our public health service and our foreign aid missions. So we are going to be much less prepared to deal with the next outbreak. The capacity to intervene early is not going to be there.
Let me bring in Greg Gosick. What borders, he asks, globally are the most hazardous as measured in fatalities to anyone attempting unauthorized crossings? And he mentions, say, as an example, North and South Korea.
Well, I mean, very few people attempt to cross that border. So if you're measuring it in terms of total number of fatalities, it's quite low, because people know if they try to cross that border, there's a pretty good chance that they will be shot. I mean, that was the same for the Cold War inter-German border. There were a dozen or so fatalities a year, and people mostly didn't try to get across, though they did sometimes succeed. Actually, that border was not completely sealed even at the height of the Cold War. But in terms of numbers, the deadliest borders are Europe and the United States. The death numbers in the Mediterranean, and it varies from year to year, but they've been as high as about 2,500 a year of people trying in boats that are not suited for the journey or overloaded to get across the Mediterranean Sea, either from Northern Africa or from Turkey, in some cases, into Europe. The US border with Mexico, again, the numbers vary, but somewhere between 500 and 800 people die in a typical year trying to cross the border from Mexico into the United States. So the numbers may be higher because the bodies aren't always found, but in terms of numbers, those two are by far the largest.
And there's certainly been a large increase with the numbers trying to leave, going through Tunisia, as you said, into
Yeah,
the
no, no,
Mediterranean.
Tunisia, Libya, there are a number of different routes, and the European numbers, as I say, fluctuate a lot. Last year they were a little lower than they'd been for some time. This year they seem to be spiking back up again a bit, but they do go up and down.
Luazi Bululu, I apologize if I've mispronounced your name, asks or says, related with the New Zealand journalist story, with the impetus to impose stricter border controls, what are the risks citizens and legal immigrants face from overreaching governments wanting to secure borders?
Well, I mean, we're living through examples of it here in the United States. The arrest of the student Columbia, who's a legal permanent resident and facing the possibility of deportation. There's some evidence that several of the people on this very controversial flight to El Salvador, which the judge tried to stop, may also have been permanent residents. We're waiting to see that. The Trump administration is about to put in place a travel ban on some 43 different countries, which, I mean, in theory, should not affect permanent residents from those countries, but will have the effect of blocking people from seeing family if family happens to be in those countries. The process for stripping people of legal permanent resident status is going to be tested under this administration in a way that we have never seen before. Green card holders are not as secure as citizens. There are various pretexts under which the government can declare you a danger and strip your legal status. And the Trump administration looks determined to push those authorities farther than they have ever been pushed before. And then, if we look at the previous incidents in this country, a large scale deportation in the 1930s and again in the 1950s, there were actually a large number of citizens deported. I mean, basically racial profiling. So Mexicans who were citizens, but the border agents of the time decided they were not, and deported them. So I think newspapers are already full of these stories. I think we're going to get more and more and more.
Well, we're also seeing a lot of foreign student advisors at universities advising their international students to not go home because they risk not being able to get back into the country.
I think that is absolutely true. I mean, this happened not unusually after 9/11, particularly if you were from a foreign student from a country like Pakistan or Morocco or in Algeria or some other country that the United States considered a potential source of terrorists. I think we are in a similar situation, but at much larger scale. The Trump administration has instituted a registration requirement for foreigners who are here on all sorts of different visas, including student visas. So there's going to be an effort to track who these people are, what their movements are, much more closely than we've seen any time since the Second World War. So these are quite extreme measures, going far beyond what we saw in the first Trump administration.
So this is a good time to bring in a question from one of our viewers who is curious on your perspective regarding work visa impacts on students who are studying for degrees in STEM fields and the impacts on career opportunities for recent college graduates.
I mean, it's hard to know. I have not so far seen a significant number of new initiatives out of this administration aimed at legal migrants, which would include foreign students here, studying on a visa. There's a path through optional practical training in the H-1B program. In the first Trump administration, there was an effort through the regulatory system to tighten the H-1B system quite dramatically, to increase the reporting requirements for companies, to try to challenge many more applications than we had seen in the past, to restrict spouses of H-1B visa holders in various ways to make the United States a less welcoming place for those high-skilled migrants. I think in the second administration, that is still TBD. partly because of the role of Elon Musk and the tech industry in this administration. That was not a factor in Trump 1. It is in Trump 2. And those executives rely heavily on foreign born STEM workers. And Musk has been quite clear. There's been this sort of bubbling battle between Elon Musk and Steve Bannon about, are H-1Bs, good
Right.
contributors to the American economy? Or are they foreigners taking American jobs? So I'm not sure how that issue is going to play out in the second administration. So far, most of the effort seems to be a combination of ramping up deportation to numbers that we've never seen before. So removing people from the country, including a lot of people who've been here a long time. And again, we're seeing stories every day, and tightening the borders through travel bans, through basically barring all refugees and asylum seekers. The administration looks likely to reenact Title 42 on the southern border. We write about that extensively in the book, the misuse
You
of
know,
a
tell
public.
us what Title 42 is. I know now because I've read your book, but summarize that for us.
So Title 42 is a provision of the Centers for Disease Control regulations that say in the case of diseases with pandemic potential, the CDC has the authority to shut down the borders in whatever way it deems fit. That can be, everything from, from doing, actually, no, let me rephrase that, but to shut down the borders in whatever ways it sees fit. The provision had never been used before in the United States. And in the first Trump administration, not right at the outset of the pandemic, but some months into it, Stephen Miller, who was back as the president's top advisor on these issues, went to the CDC and said, I want to see Title 42 invoked on the southern border to stop asylum seekers. And the final chapter of our book is based on a series of extensive interviews with Dr. Martin Cetron. And Dr. Cetron was, for 25 years, the director of global migration and quarantine for the CDC. He was the official who was in charge of deciding whether Title 42 would be used or not. And he refused. He said, no, this is a completely inappropriate use of the statute. COVID is already widely prevalent in the United States. There's no epidemiological evidence that asylum seekers are bringing COVID in significant numbers. And he refused. It was kicked up to his boss, Dr. Robert Redfield. So he was overridden. Amazingly, he didn't lose his job. I think he would in the new administration, but held on to his job. But Title 42 was instituted and stayed in place for a long time. The Biden
Hmm.
administration had a heck of a time removing it. Combination of their own political concerns. They feared that without Title 42, we would see a fresh surge of asylum seekers, which would hurt them politically, but also efforts by the states, particularly Texas, to prevent the Biden administration from removing that provision. It was the last COVID border restriction removed anywhere in the world, May 2023, about 5 months after China reopened. So that doesn't look good. And I mean, this was sort of a year and a half after any pretense of social distancing or masking or other measures
Right.
in the United States was gone. So it was maintained. In fact, Justice Gorsuch, in a case at the Supreme Court, said as much. Said it's being maintained for border control reasons, not for public health reasons.
So another issue that you discuss quite a bit in the book is what is essential, who is an essential employee. As many of our viewers know, I like to ride a bike, and that was a big issue in Texas, whether or not bicycle stores could be open because they
Yeah.
were a mode of transportation. But there sure was a lot of conflict about that whole issue of who's essential.
There was a lot of conflict, and we don't deal with it as much in the domestic context. I mean, a lot of you will know that there were quite a few people. You think of the workers in Amazon warehouses who were essentially forced to keep coming to work, and they ran much higher risks than those of us who were lucky enough to be university professors and we could teach our students online. So the essential category for domestic workers exposed you to much greater levels of risk. At the borders, there was a decision made in most countries, but especially obvious here in North America, that any restrictions on trade were simply politically unacceptable. That if people saw grocery store shelves empty, they would panic. And there was, a little bit of that with the supply chain disruptions we saw. But for the most part, throughout the pandemic, we were able to continue to get the goods we wanted. And that was made possible essentially by declaring anyone working with trade to be an essential worker. And so that meant, even though Donna McCall's children couldn't cross the border to say goodbye to their mother, you could be a trucker coming from the most infected parts of the South and drive up into Canada with no particular requirements to be careful. You could drive up to drop off your goods. There's no question this led to higher numbers of cases. If you look in Africa and Latin America, the trucking routes were the vector for spreading the disease. But that was all considered essential. Workers in medical professions, again, there were often good reasons for that, were allowed to move back and forth. Some of the biggest victims of the essential category were container ship workers.
Oh, and I have to interject. The pages you wrote about that were really sobering.
Yeah, thank you. So, in order to get our computers and our Pelotons and whatever else we wanted delivered from Amazon, you had the workers on container ships, going across the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. Most of them coming from poorer countries, from the Philippines, from Indonesia, from Russia. In a lot of cases, rather poorly paid. And as countries began to shut their borders, no one would let them get off. Normally, these container ship workers would rotate off, and new crews would come on. But in many cases, we ended up with these container ship workers trapped, a year and a half, 2 years on these ships, just going back and forth in this exhausting work. No one would let them off to go back home. There were cases we write about in the book of people with, reasonably serious medical conditions who weren't, allowed off the ships. They had to be taken to another port where they would be let in. The organization that represents the world's giant retailers called it a modern form of slavery. And it took a long time before countries began to ease up those
Well,
restrictions.
your description certainly reinforces that thought. I want to be sure we have a chance to talk about the special relationship, what it is with Canada. But before we go there, Debeth Stewart asks, what are some of the current trends in countries' border policy that have been influenced by COVID for the longer term? Are there distinct examples of countries seeking to rebuild those collaborative crisis structures?
I mean, it's a great question. Generally, the consequences have been in the other direction. COVID showed governments that they could close borders pretty effectively. I mean, the rhetoric for years was that, we have open borders. We can't close them. Well, COVID countries closed their borders pretty effectively, and they managed it in ways that were politically very popular. So border closures have become a much more usable tool than they were before. Governments know how to do it, and they know in most cases that it will be popular. The one place that has tried to push back against this is Europe. And I think it's for two reasons. One, Europeans see mobility as a core part of the European project. There was a lot of dismay in Europe over the decisions by national governments to restrict their borders early in the pandemic, particularly after the huge outbreak in Italy that some of you might recall. So there were big efforts from the European Commission and others to try to move back to more cooperative measures. The other thing in Europe is there are a lot of people who literally live across borders. Going back to where we started, one of the reasons I wrote this is that in various ways, I've lived my life back and forth across that border. I see myself as a cross-border person. That's relatively rare here in the United States. In Europe, it's quite common. You have about 30% of the European population that lives in these cross-border regions, and a lot of them move back and forth quite freely. So the COVID restrictions were a massive shock. We write at length about Norway and Sweden, where that border had basically never been closed, and the shock that was felt, particularly on the Swedish side, because it was the Norwegians closing to the Swedes. So there have been serious efforts in Europe. I think, unfortunately, it's a minority position now. I think the enthusiasm for border measures keeps going up year after year.
And people have seen how easy it is to establish these border
You can
controls.
establish it reasonably easily, and this is probably true for most of your audience here, and it's true for most Americans. It didn't affect them all that much, right? If you've established, if you have work or you study or you have personal relationships that cross borders, the COVID closures were quite profound. If you don't, they probably didn't affect you all that much. I mean, one of the arguments we make in the book is that people need to be aware of this, right? I think, we've had governments for some decades now saying, oh, the world is growing more united, travel's easy, come be a tourist here, come be a student. Well, when you do that, you build personal relationships across borders, and those are reasonably tenuous. The question about what does legal permanent residence mean right now, and is that a safe situation? And these questions are all arising again. We can't just assume and for a long time this has not been true for a lot of people in the world, but those of us fortunate enough to have passports where we've been able to move quite freely, we have to be more careful. Governments are pulling away a lot of the privilege that we've had.
Well, let me read you quotes from two Republican presidents. The first one, Ronald Reagan. Let it forever be not a point of division, but a meeting place between our great and true friends. We're referring to the Canadian-American border.
Yeah.
Last week, President Trump said, Canada only works as a state. It is an artificial line of separation. When President Trump began talking about this, I think most of us thought he was just using it as perhaps a way to get attention or even a negotiating ploy. But Ted, it seems more than that. How do you see it?
Oh, I think he's quite serious. I mean, it gets a little beyond the scope of the book, and I certainly, I followed Trump very closely for years, but I can't say that I expected this. There are elements of what Trump is saying that really I think take us back to the 19th century, before the agreements of the 20th century that said, for the most part, borders should be inviolable, because if they're not, it's a recipe for war and other forms of violence. He seems to be going back much more sort of 19th century imperialism, and he has territorial ambitions, not just Canada, but Greenland, and wanting to take the Panama Canal back. The part of this that connects to the book is that one of the things I'm afraid we've seen happen over the last decade is the Canadians and Americans stop nurturing that cross-border relationship. From the Canadian side, I think some of it was dismay with our political choices down here. I mean, Trump and Trudeau did not get along at all. The COVID border closures had a lot to do with Canadians being appalled at how they felt we were mismanaging the pandemic and not taking masking and social distancing and other measures seriously. But the consequence of that has been there has been no serious effort to try to build collaborative arrangements along the border for more than a decade now. In the aftermath of 9/11, there were a whole series of ongoing, constant negotiations and high-level summits and all the efforts to sort of nurture and build that relationship. And those have really weakened. And I think that, the Canadians are desperately now trying to figure out who are their friends in the United States and how can they push back successfully, because they're obviously, I think probably most Americans think this is a ludicrous idea. But the question is, what are the mechanisms to push back on a president who has imperial ambitions? I was just in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago. The Canadians are really deeply shocked, and I think, beginning to move from just pure shock to trying to think more strategically about how they can prevent an outcome that obviously nobody in that country wants to see, or very, very few people.
Your boss, Michael Froman, back on just last week, March 14th, wrote his weekly, I guess I would call it his op-ed piece to the
Yeah,
members of the
yeah,
Council on Foreign Relations.
yeah.
And he said that he pointed out soft lumber, dairy, that there were areas where perhaps Canada should level the playing field. Do you agree with Michael? And I'll leave it at that. Do you agree with Michael on that?
Honestly, no. I vetted that piece in advance for factual accuracy. It's factually accurate. I completely disagree with the perspective. There are trade issues with Canada. The Canadians have a lot of trade issues with the United States. It's the largest two-way trade relationship in the world. Sort of goes back and forth with U.S. Mexico. They're either 1-2 or 2-1, and so you're always going to have those kinds of issues, but there's nothing there that should lead to a breakdown of this sort. We
Magnitude.
have a
Yeah.
relationship, a friendship, an alliance going back more than a century. So, yeah, there are irritants in the trade relationship. There are things I wish the Canadians did differently. There are things I wish the US did differently. I mean, we talk about dairy. Look at our sugar protection. Our sugar industry is the most protected sugar industry in the world. So we don't have clean hands here. So yeah, I didn't think that was Mike's best piece, but don't tell him that
Okay.
since he's my boss.
Well, I hope he's listening. Uh, Quick question from Mike Muth. Given the severe labor shortages are forecasted in the coming years, how do you see labor migration?
Yeah, we're actually doing a seminar on this next week. If you check on the CFR website with Giovanni Perry of the University of California, Davis, who is the expert on this. So, Michael, if you want a really, really good answer, watch that and listen to what Giovanni has to say. At a high level, what we saw over the last couple of years, and it was very bad for Biden politically, but it was very good for the economy. We had extremely high levels of immigration, some of that being a post-COVID rebound. And it was a big part of bringing inflation back under control. Labor demand was extremely high in this country. And historically, before we began trying to control this so much, Mexican labor flow was almost entirely a function of labor market demand here in the United States. A lot of it was seasonal for agriculture. We've begun to put various barriers in place. But I think, the one thing you can say with confidence about everything this administration is doing on the economic front is that it's inflationary. I mean, the tariffs are inflationary in an obvious way. The immigration restrictions and deportations are inflationary in the sense that you're going to create a labor shortage. And that will force employers to bid up wages, which is good in some respects, but also inflationary. So I think there's every reason to believe that we're going to see a rather significant spike in inflation if those policies do
Well,
not.
the percentage of immigrant laborers in construction and agriculture are, 50%. And then when you look at what needs to be done on the East Coast because of the hurricanes or on the West Coast because of the
Or the fire.
wildfires.
Yeah. No, construction's a very obvious one because getting back to lumber, there's already a tariff on Canadian lumber because for a long time we think they haven't been playing fair, but the Trump administration has launched a national security investigation into lumber, which is probably going to result in a 50% tariff on lumber. A lot of the construction lumber here in the United States comes from Canada, so
Well,
all of
Ted,
that
I,
drive up
I
prices.
I really want to thank you for being on World Now with Jim Falk, and please extend our appreciation to Laurie. You guys have written a really important book, and it's a good read. I really enjoyed spending time going through it.
Thanks so much, Jim. Great to be with you and with all the viewers here. Thank you.
And I want to remind everybody again on March 31st, Town Hall with Senator Murphy, good senator of Connecticut. That's a free program. Just go to the World Affairs Council of Connecticut website to register for this program. And I have some exciting news. I don't have dates for you, but upcoming guest on World Now will be Larry Wright. He's written another bestseller, Human Scale. I started it last night, read the first 100 pages, and I wrote to the publicist today and said, "Oh, I wish I didn't need to sleep. But as soon as I have my dinner tonight, I'm going back to read Human Scale by Larry Wright. Then New Cold Wars coming out in paperback. I suspect most of you have read it but it'll be great fun to hear what David Sanger has to say when we talk with him, probably in mid-June. Again, many, many thanks for tuning in. Spread the word, and we'll see you next time on World Now. Have a good evening.